hatred, let me so love. Amen. Today we have been remembering St. Francis, one of the most popular saints in the church. And we've been celebrating the tradition of his love for animals. And so we blessed all sorts and conditions of critters at the 9 o'clock service. However, it seems to me that Francis's life was not about a sentimental love of nature, but a clear understanding of the interactive nature of creation, the mutual dependency and regard for all things. Francis and his followers celebrated the immanence of God, the presence of God, the nearness of God in all that is. Human beings were accountable for the rest of creation, as mothers and fathers are accountable for their children's care and nurture. Treating the earth as an object, an it, over which we have power, objectifies the earth. We think we do have power over it. And we think we have power over it and then treat our neighbors as though we have power over them. It is always the bully, isn't it? The one who has been bullied becomes the bully and comes home from school and kicks the dog. Power over relationships are always destructive relationships, and they always end up in violence. In Matthew chapter 11, from which the lesson for today is appointed, begins with John the Baptist sending his disciples out to ask Jesus, "Are you the one that was to come?" And Jesus responded, "Go back and tell John what you are hearing and what you are seeing, that the blind can see, the lame can walk, and those who are weary and overburdened are strengthened and refreshed." Jesus' words, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will refresh you," reminds us that the incomparable, compassionate love of God is a gift that empowers us into life. With God as responsible human beings who seek a deeper relationship with God and with one another. At the 9 o'clock service, I had everybody that was there lean over and pet their critter that they had brought and say, "I love you." And then I had them turn to their neighbors on either side and say, "I love you." Now, why don't you do the same thing? Why don't you turn to your neighbor and tell your neighbor that you love them? Yeah, go ahead. You can do it. You can do it. It's the Episcopal Church, but we can do it. You see, the yoke that Jesus offered us is about sharing a load. It's about the hard work of living in covenant relationship with God and with our neighbor, reminding us that we are not alone. I do not come into this house of God alone. I do not offer my prayers alone, but in community with all of you. The burdens that I carry, I share with you, and you share your burdens with me. The rest that Jesus offered is not idleness or inactivity, kicking back or just hanging, but strengthening to carry out God's passion for justice. Justice which is rooted in respecting the dignity of every human being. Passion which is seeing all persons in God's divine spirit, in the image of God, as we say, and living lives through which others are able to find God's peace and justice, which is not exacting revenge, but reestablishing relationship. I want to say that again because I think it's so important today. God's peace and God's justice is not about exacting revenge, but it is about reconnecting, reestablishing relationship. Francis of Assisi lived Jesus' command throughout his passionate love of creation. Francis was a simple man who lived in a time of war, during the Fifth Crusade, as a matter of fact, a time when those who were sick and dying had few that would take care of them. He is remembered for his love of people and of animals and the stars and the moon and the sun. He is remembered for stories about his care for the very sick, even the lepers, the birds, the animals, the way he tamed a wolf so that everyone in town was no longer afraid, but in fact very sad when the wolf died and was no longer there to feed every night. But Francis was most passionate about preaching the good news of Jesus. And this is reflected in his writings and his prayers and in the poetry that we still say and sing today. However, as Francis, that is Pope Francis, the first pope to take his name, has said, it is a mistake for us to sweeten Francis, to domesticate Francis, to leave him out in our gardens by the bird bath with the birds resting on his shoulder. Francis was a humble man. He was known for his natural sweetness, but he was passionate that we should love one another, passionate that we should love God through loving one another and all creation. He expressed his love of God through respect for the earth and all the critters, raising our awareness for God's call to us to be aware of our responsibility to the earth and all its richness, all the joy and the wonder, the fellowship, and the delight that the critters and creatures and objects of creation bring to us. Francis's greatest gift, I believe, was his ability to see the face of Christ in everyone he met, whether a leper or a bishop, a Christian or a Muslim, a friend or a stranger. Seems to me I was preaching this same thing about Mother Teresa, or Saint Teresa, as she is now, just a few weeks ago. But according to the tradition, St. Francis was told by God to repair my house, to transform the church, because it had become corrupt in the 13th century. He was to restore, to reorder the church, to get rid of the emphasis on the hierarchy, on ritual, wealth, and power, and turn it into a church that is humble, radically inclusive, a church that looks out for the poorest and brings them hope, which he did by founding the Franciscan order. In the view of Francis and his followers, property arouses envy and thus conflict, and thus destroying peace. His followers during Francis's lifetime never owned any property. Francis himself never owned anything. He didn't even own a Bible. He had a psalter, and that was all. To be part of the Franciscan order, a man had to sell everything he owned and give all the proceeds to the poor, sever all his ties with his family. This is not about the redistribution of wealth, but rather it was about equality, about their all being brothers equally together. As one medieval source reported, when a novice asked Francis for a psalter, Francis responded, "When you have a psalter, you're going to want a breviary. And when you have a breviary, you will install yourself on a throne like a great prelate, and then you will command your brother, 'Bring me my breviary.'" It was not a call for political change that Francis was asking, but a longing for peace and to be an instrument of God's peace, of God's consolation, of God's understanding, of God's love. In other words, Francis believed that religion should be a force for peace instead of a cause for violence. And that led him to travel to Egypt in the midst of the Fifth Crusade. Tradition holds that in 1219 he met with Sultan Malik al-Kamil. When finally the Muslim forces drove the Christians from the Holy Land, the Sultan surprised the world and treated those Christians with mercy as they fled Egypt. Was it due to the influence of Francis? Well, perhaps it was. Francis's life, his writings, his teachings, his manner of being all reflect his commitment to carry that yoke of Jesus. When his followers, his brothers, asked Francis the way to salvation, he advised them to find their own way. On his deathbed, Francis told them, "I have done what was mine to do. May Christ teach you what is yours." I believe that at the heart of the spiritual life is paying attention. Paying attention to facial expressions and body language. Paying attention to people's needs and people's wants. Paying attention to the sky outside, whether it's going to bring us rain or a beautiful sunny day. Paying attention to the amount of water in the river and how it flows. Paying attention to the quality of the light, the sunset and the sunrise. My friends, look around you. Look at all the beauty, not just here inside St. James's, but outside. Recall all the people you've had an opportunity to love. But God created us in love, to love God and to love one another, to build up, not to tear down, to draw together, not to divide and separate. Living in hope of what can be, not in fear of what might be. It is the wholeness of all creation that is the central vision of Jesus and of his servant Francis. Everything in the world has the potential of revealing God's glory, and we miss it if we don't stop long enough to give our attention to what is there to be seen. If we have not looked deep enough or close enough at the people and the world around us. Today, St. Francis Day, we are reminded of the wonder of God's great act of love in creation. And the amazing thing is that all of this is connected. It is all intertwined. No created thing is isolated from another. We are bound and linked, dependent on one another, dependent on the elements, dependent on the sun, the moon, the oceans, the animals, dependent on the air, the water, the heat, dependent on the companionship. There is so much more that I could say about Francis. And in this time of strife and war, perhaps the most significant thing we can do is to hold in our hearts the prayer attributed to Francis, so that we might indeed be instruments of God's peace. Amen.